It all started on a cold, overcast afternoon at a restricted military airfield. The runway stretched wide and silent, lined with gray transport aircraft parked in perfect formation. Soldiers in uniform moved in steady lines, their boots striking the concrete in rhythm, until everything suddenly stopped. A medical stretcher burst into view. Two men rushed forward, pushing it as fast as they could across the open tarmac. One was a civilian doctor in a white coat, his face tight with urgency. The other was a commercial pilot, still wearing his crisp white uniform and captain's hat, his hands gripping the stretcher rails with visible tension. Lying on the stretcher was an elderly man. His skin was pale, almost gray. His chest rose unevenly, each breath shallow and labored. A thin oxygen mask covered his mouth, fogging faintly with every fragile inhale. His eyes were closed, his body unnaturally still. "Stay with me," the doctor said firmly, checking the man's pulse again. "Don't lose him now." The pilot leaned closer, his voice low but steady. "Keep breathing, just keep breathing." Nearby, soldiers froze mid-step. Conversations died instantly. Heads turned. This was not a drill. This was not routine. Behind them, massive military aircraft loomed like silent witnesses, their propellers still, their presence amplifying the seriousness of the moment. A red emergency vehicle sped toward the runway, its lights flashing but its siren muted by protocol. The doctor glanced up, his expression sharp. "He wouldn't have made it another 10 minutes in the air," he said. "We had no choice." The pilot didn't answer. His jaw was tight, eyes locked forward. He knew exactly what this meant. They had landed here without clearance. This airfield was restricted, one of the most controlled military zones in the region. No civilian aircraft was permitted to touch this runway without direct authorization. And yet, moments earlier, he had brought his plane down anyway, ignoring repeated warnings from air traffic control. All because the man on this stretcher was dying. A group of armed security personnel moved in quickly, forming a perimeter. One officer raised his hand, signaling them to stop. "Who authorized this landing?" the officer demanded. The pilot didn't hesitate. "I did." The officer's eyes narrowed as he looked at the stretcher, then back at the pilot. "You understand where you are?" "Yes," the pilot replied, "and I understand what I did." The doctor stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension. "If we delay even one more minute, this man won't survive." For a brief moment, no one spoke. The wind swept across the runway. Flags snapped sharply in the distance. The old man's breathing grew weaker, slower. And standing there on that military runway, surrounded by authority, weapons, and rigid rules, the pilot faced a reality he could not undo. He had broken the law to save a life, without knowing that the life he was fighting for would soon change everything. Less than 40 minutes earlier, the situation had looked very different. The aircraft was cruising at altitude, the cabin calm, the engines steady. Passengers remained seated, unaware that a medical emergency was unfolding just a few rows behind the cockpit. The elderly man had collapsed without warning. At first, it appeared to be simple dizziness, but within seconds, his breathing became irregular, his skin turned pale. A nearby passenger called for help, and a flight attendant rushed forward. "Is there a doctor on board?" The response came immediately. The same doctor now pushing the stretcher stepped into the aisle, already assessing the man's condition. His movements were fast but controlled. He checked the pulse, too weak, blood pressure dropping, oxygen saturation dangerously low. "This is critical," he said quietly. "He needs immediate hospital access." The pilot was notified within minutes. Inside the cockpit, the captain listened carefully as the situation was relayed. He asked precise questions: heart rate, responsiveness, breathing pattern. Each answer narrowed the options. The nearest civilian airport was over an hour away. The doctor's voice came through again, urgent but measured. "He doesn't have an hour." The pilot studied the navigation display. One location stood out, closer than any public airport. A military airbase. He contacted air traffic control immediately, requesting emergency clearance. The response was firm and unyielding. "Denied. That airspace is restricted." He tried again, explaining the medical situation in detail. Silence followed, then repetition of the same instruction. Maintain course. Proceed to the designated civilian airport. The pilot removed his headset briefly. Exhaling slowly, he had faced difficult decisions before, but this one carried weight beyond standard protocol. Turning toward the military base would violate airspace regulations. It could result in license suspension, criminal charges, or worse. But doing nothing meant watching a man die in the air. He looked through the cockpit window at the open sky ahead, then back at the instruments. "Doctor," he said into the intercom. "How much time?" There was a pause. "Minutes," came the reply. "Not much more." That was enough. The pilot adjusted the heading without further discussion. He informed the cabin crew of an emergency descent and secured the cockpit. He did not announce the destination. He did not wait for permission. As the aircraft descended, warning messages filled the console. Unauthorized approach, restricted zone. The pilot acknowledged none of them. His focus remained singular. Get the plane on the ground. Get the man help. By the time the wheels touched the military runway, the decision had already been made. Whatever the consequences, he would face them. Because in that moment, saving a life mattered more than every rule he had ever been trained to follow. The aircraft had barely come to a full stop when military response units moved in. Before the cabin doors were fully opened, armored vehicles rolled onto the runway from both sides. Armed personnel surrounded the plane in a tight formation. Weapons lowered but ready. Red and white warning lights flashed across the tarmac, reflecting off the aircraft's fuselage. The pilot remained seated for a moment, hands still on the controls. He knew this would not be handled quietly. Once the cabin door opened, security officers boarded immediately. Their expressions were firm, procedural, and uncompromising. "Captain," one officer said, displaying his credentials, "you landed in a restricted military zone without authorization." "Yes," the pilot replied, "I'm aware." The officer glanced past him, noticing the doctor and the elderly man being carefully lifted onto the stretcher. "That does not change the violation," the officer said. The doctor stepped forward, his voice steady but urgent. "This patient is unstable. We need immediate access to medical facilities." The officer hesitated briefly, then signaled his team. "Escort the patient to the medical unit," he ordered. "Now." As the stretcher was wheeled off the aircraft, several soldiers followed closely, maintaining visual control. The elderly man's condition remained critical. His breathing was shallow, his pulse barely detectable. On the runway, the pilot was separated from the crew. Two officers escorted him away from the plane toward a security checkpoint. Nearby, soldiers spoke rapidly into radios, relaying updates to command. "You understand this is a serious breach," one officer said as they walked. "I do," the pilot answered, but delaying was not an option. At the checkpoint, the pilot was instructed to remove his cap and identification badge. His license and documents were taken without comment. "Until further notice," the officer said, "you are not free to leave this base." The pilot nodded. He showed no resistance. In the distance, the doctor disappeared through the doors of a military medical building with the stretcher. The sound of the doors closing echoed across the concrete. Minutes passed. A senior officer arrived, his uniform marked with high-ranking insignia. He reviewed the situation quickly, listening to reports from multiple channels. "Who made the decision to land?" he asked. "I did," the pilot replied again. The officer studied him closely. "Your explanation?" "There was a medical emergency," the pilot said. "The patient would not have survived the flight to a civilian airport." The officer said nothing immediately. Instead, he turned toward the medical building, then back to the pilot. "You will remain here," he said. "Further action will depend on what happens next." The pilot stood quietly as the reality settled in. He had crossed a line few pilots ever dared to approach. And at that moment, with no knowledge of who the elderly man truly was, he believed he was about to lose everything: his career, his license, and his future, for a decision he did not regret. Inside the military medical unit, the atmosphere was controlled but tense. The stretcher was rushed through a wide corridor lined with steel doors and emergency equipment. Medical staff moved quickly, already briefed by security that the patient had arrived from an unauthorized landing. None of that mattered now. The elderly man's condition had deteriorated further. His oxygen levels continued to drop. His heart rhythm was unstable, fluctuating between dangerously slow and irregular beats. The doctor stayed at his side, issuing short, precise instructions. Prepare cardiac monitoring. Increase oxygen flow. Get IV access now. A nurse removed the man's jacket to attach the monitors. As she did, a small leather wallet slipped from an inner pocket and landed on the stretcher frame. She picked it up automatically and placed it on a nearby tray. Unopened. No one paid attention to it. All focus remained on the patient. The doctor checked the monitor again. "He's slipping," he said quietly. "We're running out of time." Emergency medication was administered. The medical team worked in silence, broken only by the steady beeping of the heart monitor and the soft hiss of oxygen. Outside the room, armed guards stood at attention. Inside, authority meant nothing. The man on the bed was no longer a figure of importance, no longer defined by status or position. He was simply an elderly patient fighting to stay alive. The doctor adjusted the oxygen mask and leaned closer. "Sir, if you can hear me, stay with us." There was no response. For a brief moment, the heart monitor faltered, the rhythm thinning dangerously. The room stiffened, hands froze in place, eyes fixed on the screen. Then, slowly, the signal stabilized. Not strong, not safe, but present. The doctor exhaled sharply. "We've bought a little time," he said, "but he needs specialized care immediately." A military physician entered the room, scanning the data. "We can stabilize him here," she said, "but only temporarily." As paperwork was prepared, a junior officer stepped inside to confirm the patient's identity for records. He glanced at the wallet on the tray, hesitated, then opened it briefly. His expression changed. He said nothing. He simply closed it and placed it back where it was, his movements noticeably more careful than before. He exited the room without explanation. The doctor did not notice. At that moment, survival remained the only priority. Elsewhere on the base, reports were being forwarded up the chain of command. The name of the patient, still unknown to most, was moving rapidly through secure channels. And while the medical team fought to keep the elderly man alive, the consequences of the pilot's decision were quietly escalating beyond anything he could have imagined. While the medical team continued their work, the situation surrounding the pilot escalated rapidly. He was escorted from the checkpoint into a secure administrative building on the base. The corridors were narrow, reinforced, and silent, designed for efficiency rather than comfort. Cameras followed every step. Inside a small interrogation room, the pilot was instructed to sit. The door closed behind him with a solid metallic sound. An officer entered moments later carrying a tablet and a folder. He placed them on the table carefully, then sat across from the pilot. "For the record," the officer said, "state your name, license number, and flight designation." The pilot complied without hesitation. "You understand you violated restricted airspace," the officer continued. "This constitutes a serious breach of national security." "Yes," the pilot replied evenly. "I was aware at the time." The officer looked up. "Then explain why you proceeded." "There was a medical emergency," the pilot said. "The patient would not have survived the diversion to a civilian airport." "Emergency protocols do not override military airspace restrictions," the officer said. The pilot met his gaze. "They do when a life is minutes away from ending." The officer paused, typing notes into the tablet. "Your aircraft is being held," he said. "Your license is under temporary suspension pending review. You are not authorized to leave this facility." The words landed heavily, but the pilot showed no outward reaction. If asked again, the officer added, "Would you make the same decision?" The pilot did not hesitate. "Yes." The officer closed the folder. Outside the room, additional personnel reviewed footage from the landing. Radar logs, radio transmissions. Every second of the approach was being analyzed. The violation was clear. So was the intent. Elsewhere on the base, a senior command meeting had been called. Briefings were underway. Information regarding the patient's identity had reached high-level officials, though it had not yet been disclosed formally. Back in the interrogation room, the pilot waited. Minutes stretched into longer intervals. No one spoke to him. No updates were given. He sat alone, replaying the descent in his mind, not the warnings, not the consequences, but the doctor's voice. He doesn't have an hour. From the hallway beyond the door, footsteps echoed, voices lowered, then stopped abruptly. The door opened again. This time, a different officer entered, older, higher rank. "You will remain available," the officer said. "Do not leave this room." "Am I under arrest?" the pilot asked. "Not yet," came the reply. The door closed once more. Unaware of the developments unfolding elsewhere on the base, the pilot remained isolated, facing the possibility that his career, and everything he had worked for, might end because of one deliberate choice. A choice he still believed was the only one he could have made. The senior command room was already active when the message arrived. Multiple officers stood around a large digital table displaying live updates from the medical unit, airfield security, and flight operations. The illegal landing had been classified as a critical incident, triggering automatic escalation procedures. Then the patient's name appeared on the screen. For a moment, no one spoke. A senior officer leaned closer, reviewing the data again to confirm it. The room fell silent as the implications became clear. "This information needs immediate verification," he said. "Secure channel only." Within minutes, identity confirmation was completed through internal databases. The elderly man was not a civilian. He was not an ordinary passenger. He was a high-ranking government official, long retired from public visibility but still holding authority at the highest advisory level. The tone in the room shifted instantly. Phones were lifted, direct lines were activated, commands were issued quietly but urgently. "Status of the patient?" one officer asked. "Critical but stable," came the response. "Medical team is maintaining life support." The senior officer straightened. "Redirect all unnecessary security procedures," he ordered. "No external reporting, no press." A separate call was placed, to the military medical director, then to the base commander. Finally, attention turned to the pilot. "What is his status?" the officer asked. "Detained for questioning. License suspended pending investigation." There was a brief pause. "Hold all punitive action," the senior officer said. "Immediately." The instruction was logged without debate. Down the hall, outside the interrogation room, an officer received the update and stopped mid-step. He read the message twice to ensure accuracy, then turned sharply. Inside the room, the pilot remained seated, unaware of the change unfolding beyond the door. He had been waiting in silence for nearly an hour. The door opened. The same officer who had questioned him earlier entered. His demeanor noticeably altered. His posture was straighter, his tone more controlled. "There has been a development," he said. The pilot looked up. "What kind of development?" "You are to remain on standby," the officer replied. "All disciplinary action is temporarily suspended." "Why?" the pilot asked. The officer hesitated, then answered carefully. "That information is not cleared for release." Across the base, guards were quietly reassigned. Radios switched frequencies. The atmosphere changed, not outwardly chaotic, but tightly controlled. The decision made by one pilot had reached levels of authority far above the runway. And although the pilot still did not know who the elderly man truly was, the system around him was already reacting to a truth that would soon surface, one that would redefine everything about that illegal landing. The confirmation did not happen publicly. It happened quietly, behind closed doors. In the military medical unit, the elderly man remained unconscious, connected to monitors that tracked every fragile heartbeat. His condition was stable but critical. The doctor stayed close, reviewing data and adjusting treatment as needed. Outside the room, two senior officers arrived and spoke briefly with the medical staff. Their voices were low, their expressions were serious. One of them requested the patient's personal effects. The wallet that had been set aside earlier was retrieved. This time, it was examined carefully and in full. Identification documents were verified against secure government databases. There was no doubt. The man on the hospital bed was a former high-ranking government official, once responsible for overseeing strategic national operations. Though retired from public office, he still held a classified advisory status and direct access to top leadership. The information was relayed immediately. Within minutes, the response was visible across the base. Uniformed personnel adjusted their posture. Guards outside the medical wing shifted from procedural stance to formal attention. Salutes were rendered without explanation. No announcements were made. But everyone who needed to know now knew. In the administrative building, the pilot was escorted out of the interrogation room, not in handcuffs. Not under force, but under close supervision. He was brought to a waiting area near the medical wing. He noticed the change immediately. The same officers who had earlier spoken to him with suspicion now addressed him with restraint and professionalism. No accusations, no raised voices. One officer finally spoke. "The patient you brought in," he said, "is not an ordinary civilian." The pilot looked up, confused but calm. "I didn't ask who he was," he replied. "He needed help." The officer nodded slowly. "That much has been noted." Across the corridor, a senior official exited a secured office and approached the medical room. His presence alone shifted the tone of the space. "This landing," the official said quietly to those around him, "likely prevented a national incident." Inside the medical room, the elderly man stirred faintly. His eyes did not open, but his breathing steadied further. The doctor observed the monitor closely. "He's responding," he said, slowly. Word continued to move upward through command channels, now carrying a different weight. What had begun as a violation was being reclassified as a critical intervention. And standing just outside the medical wing, the pilot remained unaware of the full scope of what had been revealed, only that the man he had risked everything to save was far more significant than anyone had initially believed. The consequences of that knowledge were still unfolding. The waiting room was quiet. It was a small, windowed area near the military medical wing, furnished only with a metal bench, a table, and a wall-mounted monitor displaying internal notices. Armed guards stood outside the door, but no one spoke to the pilot. He sat alone. Hours had passed since the landing, yet no formal explanation had been given. No charges were read, no resolution offered. He was simply told to wait. From where he sat, he could see part of the medical corridor through a glass panel. Medical staff moved in and out at steady intervals. Their pace suggested controlled urgency, not panic. That alone told him the patient was still alive. The pilot checked his watch, then lowered his hand. Time no longer felt relevant. He replayed the decision again, not the warning signals, not the restricted airspace alerts, but the doctor's words. "He doesn't have an hour." A military physician walked past the waiting room and paused briefly. She glanced inside, then continued on without comment. The pilot did not ask questions. He understood that whatever was happening now was beyond his control. A short while later, the doctor who had been on the flight emerged from the medical unit. His posture was tired but steady. He stopped when he saw the pilot and approached the glass. The guard opened the door just enough for them to speak. "He's stable," the doctor said quietly. "Still critical, but he's holding." The pilot nodded once. "That's enough," he replied. They stood in silence for a moment. "You did the right thing," the doctor added, "regardless of what comes next." The pilot did not respond immediately. "I didn't do it for recognition," he said finally. "I did it because it was the only option left." The doctor gave a brief nod and returned to the medical unit. The waiting resumed. Down the corridor, senior officers continued to arrive and depart. Some acknowledged the pilot with a glance. Others avoided eye contact altogether. None explained anything. Eventually, footsteps stopped outside the room. A senior officer entered, his expression controlled, his tone neutral. "You are still under review," he said, "but you are no longer considered a flight risk." "What does that mean?" the pilot asked. "It means," the officer replied, "that the situation is evolving." No further clarification was given. As the officer left, the pilot returned to his seat. He had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. He had acted without permission, broken protocol, and accepted the consequences. All that remained now was the outcome. And as he waited in that quiet room, unaware of how close he was to a life-changing turn, the weight of his choice settled fully, calm, heavy, and unshaken. The change came quietly. Late in the evening, a nurse exited the medical unit and spoke briefly with a senior officer standing nearby. The officer nodded once, then turned toward the waiting room. The pilot looked up as the door opened. "You may come with me," the officer said. "The patient has regained consciousness." They walked down the corridor together. No guards followed. No weapons were visible. The atmosphere was controlled, restrained. Inside the private medical room, the lighting was dimmed. The monitors still hummed steadily. But the alarms were silent. The elderly man lay awake, propped slightly upright, his breathing slow but consistent. The doctor stood nearby, reviewing vitals. "He's stable enough for a short conversation," the doctor said, "but keep it brief." The pilot stepped forward. For the first time since the emergency began, the elderly man opened his eyes fully and focused on him. His gaze was steady, alert, and deliberate. "You're the pilot," the man said, his voice weak but clear. "Yes, sir," the pilot replied. There was a pause. "They told me what you did," the man continued. "You landed where you weren't allowed to." "I did," the pilot said simply. The elderly man nodded slowly. "You didn't ask who I was." "No," the pilot answered. "I didn't need to." Another pause followed. The elderly man shifted slightly, wincing, then steadied himself. "For most of my life," he said, "people helped me because of my position." He looked directly at the pilot. "You helped me because I was dying." The pilot said nothing. "That matters," the man continued. "More than titles, more than authority." He reached weakly toward the bedside table, where his identification had been placed earlier. He did not touch it. "You saved my life," he said, "not as an official, as a human being." The pilot nodded once, uncomfortable with the attention. "I did what any pilot should do." The elderly man allowed a faint smile. "Most wouldn't have." The doctor stepped forward gently. "That's enough for now," he said. The elderly man nodded in agreement, then looked back at the pilot one last time. "I won't forget this," he said quietly. The pilot stepped back and turned to leave. As he exited the room, the senior officer waiting outside spoke for the first time. "Your actions are being reviewed at the highest level," he said. "You will receive formal notice soon." The pilot acknowledged him and returned to the waiting area. He did not yet know how the situation would end. But for the first time since the landing, he knew one thing with certainty. The man he had risked everything to save had survived. And that alone made the decision worth it. The formal decision was delivered the following morning. The pilot was escorted to a conference room inside the administrative building. This time, there were no guards positioned at the door. No recording devices were visible. Only a long table, several chairs, and 3 senior officials waiting inside. He took his seat without being instructed. One of the officials spoke first. "Your unauthorized landing has been reviewed in full," he said. "Radar logs, communication records, and medical testimony have all been examined." The pilot listened in silence. "Under standard regulations," the official continued, "your actions would warrant immediate suspension and legal consequences." The pilot nodded. "I understand." There was a brief pause. "However," the official said, "this situation is not standard." He slid a document across the table. "The patient you transported is a government official whose survival has been confirmed as critical to ongoing national matters," he said. "Your decision directly contributed to that outcome." The pilot did not react. "Based on these findings," the official continued, "all disciplinary actions against you are withdrawn. Your license will be fully reinstated." The room remained quiet. "In addition," the official said, "your actions will be formally recognized as an extraordinary humanitarian intervention." The pilot looked down at the document, then back up. "I didn't do this for recognition," he said calmly. "That has already been noted," the official replied. Later that day, the pilot returned to the airfield. The aircraft had been refueled and cleared for departure. Crew members greeted him with restrained relief. No public statements were made. No cameras were present. As the engines powered up, the pilot took one last look toward the medical wing. Inside, the elderly man continued his recovery under close supervision. He would remain there for some time, but his condition was no longer life-threatening. Shortly before departure, a sealed envelope was delivered to the cockpit. Inside was a single handwritten note. "You chose life when rules said no. That choice will echo far beyond this runway." The pilot folded the note carefully and placed it beside his instruments. As the aircraft rolled forward and lifted into the sky, the runway fell away beneath him, quiet, unchanged, and unaware of what had taken place. The flight continued as scheduled. No announcement was made. No explanation was given. But from that day forward, the pilot carried with him the certainty that one decision, made under pressure, without permission, and without hesitation, had not only saved a life, but quietly reshaped his own. Not through reward, not through power, but through the simple act of choosing what was right when it mattered most.